1. Opening hook. The winter secret no one expected for the first 15 seconds. Imagine this. A single object so ordinary that villagers walked past it every day without a thought. Yet during the darkest winters of World War II, it quietly saved thousands of families from freezing to death. It wasn't a new invention, it wasn't advanced technology, and it didn't require a single extra stick of firewood. It was hay. And what those families knew about it is something almost no modern household remembers. Today, we're going to uncover a forgotten piece of survival engineering that worked when nations collapsed, when fuel vanished, and when winter punished every mistake. This is not folklore. This is functional physics that kept real people alive, and if you understand it, you can apply it instantly in your own home, cabin, or off-grid shelter. Now let's begin. During the worst winters of the war, entire regions of Europe faced a brutal problem. Fuel stocks had been seized, transport lines were destroyed, and even well-prepared households watched their firewood piles shrink long before spring. In that crisis, survival didn't belong to the strongest, but to those who still remembered the knowledge their grandparents passed down. They reached for something humble, abundant, and overlooked, and they used it in ways modern science now understands perfectly. Hay became a shield, a thermal armor, a barrier against cold so effective that families who used it burned dramatically less wood than those who didn't. And the deeper you look into this method, the more you realize it was never luck. It was skill, observation, and a quiet mastery of heat that modern insulation companies never talk about. What we're about to explore is the forgotten WWII hay trick that turned simple dried grass into one of the most reliable heating tools ever used. And once you hear how it works, you'll understand exactly why this technique still deserves a place in the world today. 2. Why we forced a return to ancient knowledge when World War II swept across Europe. It didn't only destroy cities, it destroyed stability. Armies demanded timber for bunkers, railways, and trenches, and governments rationed fuel so heavily that many rural families entered winter with barely half their usual supply. In Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and the Scandinavian North, temperatures plunged well below freezing, while chimneys burned weaker than ever before. People weren't only cold, they were desperate. Yet in this desperation, something remarkable resurfaced. Older villagers remembered the methods used long before factories produced fiberglass or mineral wool. They recalled how their parents survived winters when insulation simply didn't exist. And they turned once again to hay, a resource that kept appearing after every harvest, no matter what war was raging. It was freely available, unaffected by supply chains, and perfectly suited for one purpose: slowing the escape of precious heat. What's fascinating is that this wasn't an act of creativity. It was an act of necessity grounded in memory, an instinctive return to principles that had quietly kept frontier families alive for centuries. And by rediscovering them, people in WWII gained an advantage that modern households rarely consider. They didn't try to fight winter with fire alone. They fought it by preventing heat loss in the first place. This shift in mindset is one of the greatest lessons of why winter survival. When resources shrink, you don't win by burning more. You win by protecting what you already have. And hay allowed families to do exactly that. 3. The scientific clues hidden in everyday farm life long before scientists studied R values and thermal conductivity. Farmers observed something that puzzled them. On nights when temperatures plunged past the point of danger, animals buried in hay remained warm enough to survive, even without barns or stoves. Root cellars insulated with straw held steady temperatures through entire seasons. And simple farm sheds packed with hay often felt warmer inside than well-built wooden cabins. These were not coincidences. They were field experiments repeated year after year across mountains, plains, and war-torn countryside. During WWII, families documented these observations in diaries from Poland, Hungary, and the Carpathian Mountains. They described cows surviving blizzards by burrowing into hay piles, and vegetables staying unfrozen while everything else turned rigid with frost. What they were witnessing, without using scientific words, was the physics of trapped air. Each blade of hay created micro-pockets that resisted the movement of heat, turning a loose material into a powerful insulation barrier. And once people saw this effect in their barns and storage pits, the realization came naturally. If hay could preserve the warmth of an animal's body, if it could protect food through months of freezing cold, then surely it could protect people too. This single insight transformed hay from a simple farm material into a strategic survival tool during one of the harshest periods in modern history. And the best part? The same principle still works today, exactly as it did 80 years ago. 4. The cold weather physics that made hay a quiet lifesaver. When winter tightens its grip, the rules of survival change. Heat becomes a currency, and every household must decide whether to spend it wastefully or guard it with discipline. The families who used hay during WWII understood this instinctively, even if they never used scientific terms. What they were really building was a thermal barrier based on one simple truth. Cold travels fast through solid materials, but it slows dramatically when it has to fight through layers of trapped air. Hay, when dried and loosely structured, is full of microscopic air pockets. Each pocket disturbs the movement of heat, forcing it to bounce, stall, and weaken as it tries to escape. Modern engineers call this thermal drag. Farmers simply called it warm enough to survive. This is why a small stove in a hay-banked home could heat a room for hours longer than in a normal cabin. The warmth wasn't leaking away, it was being held in place. During WWII, this principle was put to the test under brutal conditions. In Belarus and northern Ukraine, villagers built temporary winter shelters against the walls of their homes, pressing hay tightly into every corner. Soldiers who passed through later recorded something strange. Even when outdoor temperatures dropped below 20 degrees, the interiors of these hay-insulated structures were noticeably warmer, sometimes by 8 to 12 degrees. That difference could mean the line between frostbite and safety, between waking up cold and not waking up at all. And here is where the lesson becomes modern. Many of us today focus on generating more heat. Bigger heaters, stronger stoves, higher energy bills. Yet the people of WWII learned something many homeowners now ignore. You don't survive winter by feeding more fire. You survive by slowing the loss of the heat you already paid for. Hay wasn't magic. It was physics applied with absolute clarity. 5. 3 techniques Europeans used to turn hay into a winter defense during the war. Hay was not spread randomly or used as a messy pile against a wall. It was applied using specific methods that had evolved across centuries of cold climate living. Each technique addressed a different weakness in the structure of a home, and families chose the method that matched both their resources and the severity of the coming winter. The first technique was known informally as hay banking. Families stacked hay along the outside of the house, building a thick, even wall that acted like a natural windbreak. The north and east sides, where the cold winds hit hardest, received the most reinforcement. This simple act stabilized interior temperatures more than any single additional bundle of firewood could. The second technique was the underfloor cavity method. Many older European homes had raised wooden floors, and freezing air would creep underneath during winter nights. By pushing hay into those cavities, families blocked the cold at its source. Diaries from Baltic villages describe children crawling under floorboards with armfuls of hay, turning a drafty room into a sealed, warm box. The third method was the most advanced: temporary double walls. Households constructed a lightweight wooden frame around their main home, leaving a gap of several inches. That gap was then packed densely with hay, transforming the structure into a natural insulation chamber. When spring returned, the external frame was dismantled, and the hay was reused for bedding or compost. Nothing was wasted, and the home stayed warm through even the harshest winters. What makes these techniques extraordinary is not just their simplicity, but their repeatability. Anyone could build them, anyone could maintain them. And even today, with straw bales widely available, these systems remain among the most cost-effective off-grid insulation strategies in the world. 6. Maintenance secrets. The modern world overlooks one of the most surprising truths about hay insulation is that people in the past didn't treat it like a static material. They treated it as something alive, something that required attention, awareness, and a bit of discipline. This is where the difference between warm enough and dangerously cold was often decided. During WWII, families checked their hay regularly. They looked for dampness after storms because even a slightly wet section could lose up to half its insulating power. They replaced the outer layer if snow melted into it. They lifted the base of the hay off the ground by a few inches to prevent moisture wicking upward. They shook out and fluffed sections that compressed too tightly, restoring the air pockets that made the insulation function in the first place. It was a living system, one that rewarded attention and punished neglect. Modern homeowners often assume insulation is something you install once and forget. But the people who survived the coldest winters of wartime Europe understood a deeper principle. Insulation is not a product. It is a relationship between heat, air, and the materials that hold them in place. When you take care of that relationship, even simple hay becomes a powerful shield. When you ignore it, even the best modern materials can fail. And here lies another enduring lesson. Low-tech systems are not inferior. They simply require engagement. The hay trick worked because families respected the physics behind it. And if you apply that same mindset today, checking moisture, blocking drafts, protecting warm air, you will discover, just as they did, that staying warm has far less to do with how much fuel you burn and far more to do with how well you guard the heat you already have. 7. The wartime numbers that shock modern homeowners as the war dragged on and winters grew harsher. Governments across Europe quietly collected data on how civilians managed to survive the cold with almost no fuel. What they discovered still surprises researchers today. Families who insulated their homes with hay consistently burned 40 to 50% less firewood compared to households that relied on traditional heating alone. That wasn't a small efficiency gain. It was a life-saving margin. In some regions of Czechoslovakia, inspectors reported that hay-banked homes stayed warm throughout the night with just a single evening burn in the stove, while neighboring homes required 2 or even 3 refuelings to maintain the same temperature. In rural Austria, records show that hay insulation preserved the heat of a dying fire so well that embers remained usable the next morning. This meant less chopping, less gathering, and more importantly, less danger for men who risked being caught outdoors in freezing temperatures or wartime patrols. These numbers paint a clear picture. The hay trick wasn't a minor convenience, it was a decisive factor in whether a family could stretch its fuel through the winter. And here is the insight that modern homeowners rarely consider. Most heating systems fail not because they produce too little heat, but because they lose too much. A poorly insulated house is like a bucket with holes. It doesn't matter how fast you fill it if everything drains away. The people of WWII understood this intuitively. They didn't have the luxury of waste. Every ember mattered, and hay helped them hold on to every bit of warmth they could generate. This is why the hay trick still deserves attention today. It proves that the most powerful way to survive winter isn't through consumption. It's through preservation. And that is a lesson as relevant in our era of rising energy costs as it was during the darkest winters of the 1940s. 8. Why the technique disappeared after the war with so much success and so many lives preserved. Why did the hay method fade from memory? The answer has less to do with performance and everything to do with perception. When the war ended, nations rushed into industrial rebuilding. Factories resumed production. Modern insulation, fiberglass, mineral wool, and later foam boards became symbols of progress. Governments standardized building codes and encouraged citizens to upgrade to materials produced by the industrial economy. Anything homemade or agricultural was quietly pushed aside, labeled outdated or unsanitary. Families who had survived the war wanted to move forward, not backward. They associated hay with hardship, with cold winters, with fear and scarcity. As prosperity returned, even effective low-tech methods were abandoned in favor of sleek materials that came neatly packaged in bags and rolls. Over time, the wisdom of hay banking became a forgotten chapter in the history of survival. But here is the irony. Modern insulation relies on the exact same principle that made hay so effective: slowing heat transfer by trapping air. Companies now spend millions replicating what simple plant fibers achieved for free. Yet because hay isn't glossy, uniform, or manufactured, it hasn't reclaimed the respect it deserves. This is a powerful reminder for anyone preparing for future uncertainty. Sometimes the best solutions aren't new, they're just forgotten. And when supply chains fail or energy systems wobble, the techniques labeled primitive often become the most reliable ones we have. Hay didn't stop working, we simply stopped noticing. 9. Modern science confirms what we farmers already knew over the past 2 decades. Researchers studying natural building materials rediscovered something remarkable. When hay and straw are kept dry, their insulating performance rivals or even surpasses many commercial products. The reason is the same one why families relied on. Millions of tiny air pockets held within a lightweight, breathable structure. Laboratory tests measuring thermal resistance, the famous R value, show that compacted straw bales achieve levels comparable to fiberglass bats. Even loose hay, when layered properly, reduces heat loss dramatically. Ecological architects have used straw bale construction to build homes that remain warm in winter and cool in summer, all while using a fraction of the energy required by traditional designs. The material is renewable, carbon sequestering, and biodegradable. In other words, it is everything modern insulation tries to imitate. More importantly, modern experiments mirror the wartime experience. In off-grid cabins and rural homesteads, people today routinely report a 20 to 30% reduction in heating needs just by stacking straw or hay against their coldest exterior walls. Others use hay to insulate chicken coops, greenhouses, or emergency shelters, and the temperature difference is immediately noticeable. What we farmers learned through necessity, modern builders are now validating with spreadsheets, sensors, and thermographic cameras. And the conclusion is always the same. Hay works. It worked 80 years ago. It worked 200 years ago. And it will work tomorrow. The past hasn't lost its relevance. We have simply grown distant from the skills that once kept ordinary families alive through winters far harsher than most of us will ever face. 10. How to apply this technique today, safely, cheaply, and immediately. If you're wondering how this forgotten wartime method fits into the modern world, the answer is simple. It fits everywhere. Whether you live in a cabin, a small homestead, a suburban home with drafty walls, or even a weekend off-grid shelter, the principles that kept families warm in the 1940s can still be applied today with almost no cost. To start, identify the coldest sides of your home. In the Northern Hemisphere, these are usually the north and west walls, where winter winds press hardest. By stacking straw or hay bales tightly along those exterior walls, you create an instant thermal barrier that slows heat loss dramatically. Just this one step often reduces energy use without touching your heater at all. For added protection, place a simple board or tarp over the top of the bales so rain or snow doesn't soak them. Dry hay is powerful insulation. Wet hay is not. If you live in a structure with a raised floor, you can take inspiration from Baltic households during WWII. Slip hay into the cavities beneath your floorboards to stop cold air from creeping upward. It's the kind of low-effort improvement that can change the temperature of a room within a single night. And if you want to take this method to its highest level, consider the temporary winter wall, an idea perfected by families in Finland and Latvia under wartime pressure. Build a lightweight frame a few inches outside your existing wall, pack the space with hay, and seal the top from moisture. You've just created a removable insulation chamber that rivals commercial materials without buying a single roll of fiberglass. When spring arrives, simply dismantle it. The hay becomes garden mulch, animal bedding, or compost. Nothing goes to waste. This is the beauty of the hay trick. It's not only effective, it's flexible, recyclable, and achievable for anyone willing to understand the science behind it. In a world where energy bills continue to rise, this old method offers something rare: immediate results without long-term cost. 11. Why this knowledge matters in the uncertain future ahead. The same pressures that made hay insulation indispensable during WWII are quietly re-emerging in our own time. Energy prices continue to climb. Winters are becoming more unpredictable. Power outages strike unexpectedly, and modern heating systems depend on fragile grids that can fail in a single storm. The truth is simple. Resilience is once again becoming a necessity, not a luxury. Low-tech methods like hay insulation offer the exact kind of stability the modern world lacks. They don't depend on electricity, manufacturing plants, long transport lines, or digital systems. They don't require specialized tools, and unlike many modern products, they don't fail catastrophically. Hay doesn't suddenly lose all effectiveness because a component burned out or a circuit tripped. It remains reliable because its strength comes from physics, not technology. There's also a deeper reason this knowledge matters. Hay insulation reminds us that survival is not about having the most advanced equipment. It's about understanding the natural materials around us, using them intelligently, and recognizing that simple solutions often perform better than complex ones when the world becomes unstable. As communities explore renewable energy, off-grid living, and emergency preparedness, the hay trick stands as a reminder that we already possess many of the tools we need. We just need to remember how to use them. And when the next fuel shortage hits, or when the next winter storm takes down the power grid, the households who know these techniques will stay warm. Not because they consumed more, but because they understood more. 12. Closing, a final lesson from the winters that tested humanity. If there is one message to take from this forgotten WWII method, it is this. The past isn't a museum of obsolete ideas. It is a library of proven solutions, tested under conditions harsher than most of us will ever face. The families who survived those winters weren't lucky, and they weren't protected by modern technology. They were protected by knowledge, quiet, simple, persistent knowledge that lived in barns, in fields, and in the observation of everyday life. Hay was never just animal bedding. It was a thermal weapon, a shield against cold, a material that transformed humble homes into shelters capable of defying winter without expensive fuel or advanced tools. And that insight still matters today. When systems fail, when resources shrink, when nature becomes unpredictable, the strongest advantage you can have is not machinery, it's memory. So if this exploration helped you rediscover a piece of forgotten survival engineering, share it. Pass it on. Talk about it with someone who values practical wisdom and old-world resilience, because history only survives when we choose to remember it. And the winters of the past still have lessons to teach, lessons that may one day warm your home when you need them most.